He came home to silence, and the sound of crying that wasn't his own. The cradle was handmade, the eyes weren't. Jude Rell stood on the threshold of his stone cabin on Widow's Bluff, the wind a low moan at his back, a sound he knew better than his own name. But this other sound, this thin, reedy wail, was a trespasser. It snagged on the rough-hewn timbers of his home and pulled, a hook in the gut. He'd left for 2 weeks with a name on a piece of paper and came back with blood on his cuffs and a weight in his saddlebags that felt heavier than gold. He always came back to silence. The silence was the reward, the clean, empty space where a man could forget the things he'd done to earn it. But the silence was broken. His hand, calloused and scarred from the grip of a pistol and the pull of a rope, went to the Colt at his hip. It was a reflex, as natural as breathing. He'd killed 99 men for the prices on their heads, and the 100th just 2 days ago. A man didn't live that long in his trade by walking into a room without knowing what waited inside. He eased the door open wider, the leather of his boots whispering on the stone floor. The fire in the hearth was dead, the embers gray and cold. The single room was filled with the long, creeping shadows of dusk, and in the center of it all, placed with a deliberateness that felt like a judgment, was a cradle. It was fashioned from raw, unseasoned pine, the kind of wood that wept sap and smelled of the forest floor. He'd never seen it before. It hadn't been there when he'd left. He walked towards it, his spurs a soft, metallic chime in the sudden quiet between the baby's cries. The sound started again, a desperate, hiccuping sob that clawed at something deep inside him, something he'd buried under years of hard riding and harder killing. He looked down. The infant was wrapped in a swaddle of what looked like a man's shirt, the fabric worn soft, a dark stain near the collar that could have been sweat or blood. Stitched into the cloth, rough and uneven, were the initials A.M. Abram Mathis. The 100th name. The man he'd shot down in a dusty street in Redemption, a town that had long since forgotten the meaning of the word. And in the swaddle, a face so small, it seemed impossible it could hold so much noise, so much life. The baby's eyes were open, and they were his. Not just the color, a pale, washed-out blue like the winter sky over the plains, but the shape of them, the way they seemed to hold a sorrow that was older than the body they belonged to. He'd seen those eyes every morning of his life in the cracked piece of mirror he used for shaving. He'd seen them in the face of his father, a man who died with a bottle in his hand and a curse on his lips. He'd seen them, he realized with a jolt, that was colder than the wind outside, in the face of a woman he'd tried to forget, a woman whose name he hadn't spoken in years. Ilara. He backed away from the cradle, his hand trembling as he holstered his gun. This was a trick, a trap. Someone had left the child here to get to him. The brother of one of the men he'd killed, maybe. Or a friend of Abram Mathis, a man who'd had a wife and, apparently, a child. But the cabin was empty. The door had been barred from the inside the way he'd left it. The window was shuttered. There was no sign of entry, no broken lock, no splintered wood. It was as if the cradle and the child had simply materialized in the center of his life, a ghost made of flesh and bone. The baby cried again, a raw, demanding sound that filled the empty spaces in the room, the empty spaces in him. He looked around the cabin, at the tools of his trade hanging on the walls. The ropes, the manacles, the wanted posters with their grim, staring faces. 99 of them, nailed to the wood, a gallery of the dead. He'd kept them all, a testament to his efficiency, his ruthlessness. He'd been proud of them. Now, in the fading light, they looked like accusations. He went to the table where he kept his ledger. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its pages filled with his neat, precise script. A name, a date, a price, a life reduced to a line of ink. He opened it, his fingers tracing the entries. 99 names. He'd torn out the page for Abram Mathis, a ritual he performed after every kill, a way of closing the book, of moving on. But the name was still there, stitched into the baby's swaddle, looking up at him from the cradle. The child's cries softened to a whimper. Jude stood frozen, caught between the urge to flee, to ride out into the night and never look back, and a strange, unwelcome pull towards the cradle. He was a man who dealt in endings, not beginnings. He knew how to take a life, not how to nurture one. He'd built his world on a foundation of death, and this small, helpless creature was a crack in that foundation, a tremor that threatened to bring the whole thing down. He walked back to the cradle, his movements stiff, uncertain. He reached out a hand, then pulled it back. What was he supposed to do? He knew how to track a man for 100 miles, how to live on nothing but jerky and hate. He knew the weight of a gun, the feel of a trigger, the sound a man makes when the life goes out of him. He didn't know how to hold a baby. The infant's eyes were still on him, unblinking. There was no fear in them, no recognition, just a deep, bottomless looking that seemed to see right through him, to the hollow place where his soul used to be. He could see Alara in those eyes, in the curve of the baby's mouth. He could see the ghost of a night in a cheap hotel room, a night of whiskey and whispered promises, a night he'd tried to bury along with everything else. He'd left her. He always left. It was part of the job, part of the life. Attachments were a liability, a weakness an enemy could exploit. He'd told himself it was for her own good, that a woman like her didn't belong with a man like him. But he'd seen the look in her eyes when he'd ridden away, a look of betrayal that had haunted him for 1,000 miles. And now, it was here, in his cabin, in the face of a child who wore his eyes. The baby let out a small, contented sigh and closed its eyes. The silence that followed was different from the silence he was used to. It was heavier, filled with a presence that was both a comfort and a torment. He looked at the ledger on the table, at the 99 names that had paid for this cabin, this land, this empty life. And he looked at the cradle, at the 100th name, the one that had brought him not gold, but this. He couldn't leave the child to die. He wasn't a monster. Or was he? He'd killed men for less than the price of a good horse. He'd left them for the buzzards and the wolves, their bodies unburied, their names forgotten by everyone but him. What was one more life, a life that had barely begun? But this life had his eyes. He walked to the hearth and with hands that felt clumsy and foreign, began to build a fire. The flames caught, casting a warm, flickering light on the cradle, on the sleeping child. He found an old, clean rag and a bucket of water. He didn't know what he was doing, but he had to do something. He was Jude Rell, the man who had executed 99 men for bounty. And now, the 100th had left him a son. The days that followed were a blur of clumsy care and quiet desperation. Jude, a man who could survive a blizzard with nothing but a knife and a flint, found himself utterly defeated by the simple needs of an infant. He learned the language of crying, the subtle shifts in tone that meant hunger or pain or a loneliness so profound it echoed his own. He fed the child a mixture of goat's milk and water, heated over the fire, and delivered with a spoon. A messy, frustrating process that usually ended with more milk on the baby's chin and Jude's hands than in its stomach. He learned to change the makeshift diapers he fashioned from his own shirts, his rough, calloused fingers fumbling with the soft, delicate skin. He didn't name the boy. To name him would be to accept him, to acknowledge the bond that was growing between them, a bond that felt as dangerous as a loaded gun. He simply called him the child, or the boy, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to soothe the infant when nothing else would. He'd sit for hours by the cradle, the ledger open on his lap, reading the names of the dead as if they were a bedtime story, a litany of his sins. The boy would watch him, his pale blue eyes following Jude's every move, a silent, unblinking witness. The ghosts of the 99 men he'd killed began to feel more present, their faces swimming in the shadows outside the firelight. He'd see them in the trees when he went to chop wood, their eyes peering out from behind the bark. He'd hear their voices in the wind, whispering his name, their laughter a cold, mocking sound. He'd always been a man who lived with ghosts, but now they had a new reason to haunt him. They weren't just the specters of his past. They were the legacy he was passing on to this child. He started talking to the boy, not in the soft, cooing tones of a father, but in the harsh, clipped sentences of a man confessing his crimes. He told him about the men he'd killed, about the blood on his hands, about the emptiness that had settled in his soul. He told him about Alara, his voice cracking on her name, the memories coming in broken, painful fragments. A smile, a touch, a whispered word. He'd tried to bury her, but she was here, in the curve of the boy's ear, in the way his hair curled at the nape of his neck. She had hair like spun gold. He'd murmur, his gaze fixed on the child's head, and a laugh that could make a man forget his own name. He'd never told anyone these things, had never allowed himself to feel them. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, with only the boy as his audience, the words came pouring out, a torrent of grief and regret. He found himself looking at his own reflection more often, not in the cracked mirror, but in the boy's eyes. He saw the lines around his own eyes, the hardness in his jaw, the weariness that had settled deep in his bones. He saw the man he had become, a man made of violence and loss. And he saw something else, something he hadn't seen in a long time. A flicker of the boy he had been, before the world had taken its toll, before he had started collecting names in his ledger. One night, a storm rolled in, the thunder shaking the cabin to its foundations. The boy, who usually slept through the night, began to cry, a high, terrified wail that cut through the noise of the wind and the rain. Jude picked him up, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he held the small, trembling body against his chest. He walked the floor with him, his footsteps a steady, rhythmic beat against the chaos outside. He hummed a tune he hadn't heard in years, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him, the words long forgotten, but the melody still there, a ghost of a gentler time. The boy slowly quieted, his sobs turning to soft, hiccuping breaths. He snuggled closer to Jude, his small hand gripping Jude's finger. And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the warmth of the child in his arms, Jude felt something shift inside him. A wall he had built around his heart, a wall made of stone and ice, began to crumble. He looked down at the boy, at the face that was a mirror of his own, and he saw not just the ghost of his past, but the possibility of a future. A future he had never dared to imagine, a future that was both terrifying and beautiful. He was still a man with blood on his hands, a man with a ledger full of names. But he was also a man holding a child. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt something other than the cold, hard weight of his own damnation. He felt a flicker of hope. The hope was a dangerous thing, a fragile flame in the darkness of his life. He tried to snuff it out, to go back to the man he had been, the man who felt nothing, who needed no one. But the boy was a constant reminder of the change that had taken root in him. The boy's smile, a rare and precious thing, could undo him in a way that no bullet ever could. His laughter, a sound as clear and bright as a mountain stream, could wash away some of the grime that clung to his soul. He started to make changes to the cabin, small things at first. He sanded down the rough edges of the cradle, his hands, so used to the cold, hard steel of a gun, now working with wood, shaping it, smoothing it. He bought a goat from a homesteader a few miles down the mountain, a scrawny, bad-tempered animal that gave surprisingly rich milk. He even tried to sing to the boy, his voice a rusty, unused thing, but the boy seemed to like it, his eyes closing in contentment as Jude's rough baritone filled the small cabin. He stopped looking at the wanted posters on the wall. He took them down one by one, folding them carefully and placing them in a wooden chest, along with his ledger. He didn't burn them. He couldn't. They were a part of him, a part of the story that had led him to this place, to this child. But he didn't need to see them every day, didn't need their dead eyes following him around the room. He still had nightmares. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, the faces of the men he'd killed swimming in his vision, their hands reaching for him, for the boy. He'd go to the cradle and watch the child sleep, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The sight of him, so innocent, so untouched by the violence that had defined Jude's life, was both a comfort and a torment. He was a poison, a blight on this child's life. What right did he have to raise him, to love him? One afternoon, as he was chopping wood, he saw a rider approaching. His hand went to his gun, his body tensing. He was a man with many enemies, a man who never knew when his past would come riding up his trail. He pulled the boy's cradle further into the shadows of the cabin, his heart pounding in his chest. The rider was a young man, no older than 20, with a face that was a mixture of fear and determination. He rode a tired-looking horse and wore the clothes of a farmer, not a gunslinger. He stopped a few yards from the cabin, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of Jude, a man who looked like he had been carved from the mountain itself. "I'm looking for Jude Rell," the young man said, his voice trembling slightly. "You found him," Jude said, his voice flat, his hand still on his gun. "My name is Samuel Mathis," the young man said. "Abram Mathis was my brother." Jude's blood ran cold. He had known this day would come. He had known that the 100th name would not be the last. He had just hoped he would have more time. "I've come for what's mine," Samuel said, his gaze shifting to the cabin, to the cradle in the shadows. "I've come for my nephew." The world seemed to stop. The wind died down. The birds fell silent. The only sound was the beating of Jude's own heart, a frantic, desperate drum. He had killed the boy's father. Now the boy's uncle had come to claim him. It was just. It was right. The boy belonged with his own blood, with a family that could give him a name, a home, a life free from the shadow of a man like Jude. But the thought of letting him go was like a knife in his gut. The boy was his, not by blood, but by something deeper, something forged in the quiet of the cabin, in the long dark nights of the soul. He had saved the boy, and in doing so, the boy had saved him. He looked at Samuel Mathis, at the grief and anger in his young face. He saw the family resemblance, the same dark hair, the same determined jaw as the man he had killed. He knew what he had to do. He had to let the boy go. It was the only way to truly save him, to give him a chance at a life that wasn't tainted by Jude's past. He took a deep breath, the air burning in his lungs. He was about to speak, to tell the young man to take the child and go, when a small cry came from the cabin. The boy was awake. Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes locking on the cradle. He dismounted, his movements stiff, and walked towards the cabin, his hand reaching for the gun at his hip. Jude stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "He's just a baby," Jude said, his voice a low growl. "He's my blood," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you're the man who killed his father." The two men stood facing each other, the tension between them a palpable thing. The boy cried again, a louder, more insistent wail. Jude's heart ached with a pain that was sharper than any bullet wound. He had to choose. He had to let the boy go. He stepped aside, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Take him," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's yours." Samuel pushed past him and went to the cradle. He looked down at the boy, his face a mixture of awe and sorrow. He reached out a hand, then hesitated, his gaze falling on the initials stitched into the swaddle. A.M. He looked up at Jude, his eyes filled with a sudden, dawning horror. "What have you done to him?" he whispered. "I've kept him alive," Jude said, his voice raw. "That's more than I can say for his father." The words hung in the air between them, a stark and brutal truth. Samuel looked back at the boy, at the pale blue eyes that were so much like Jude's. He saw the way the boy looked at Jude, the way his crying quieted when Jude spoke. He saw the bond that had formed between the killer and the son of the man he had killed. He had come for vengeance. He had come to take back what was his. But he had found something he never expected. He had found a father, a broken, haunted man, but a father nonetheless. He looked at Jude, at the agony in his eyes, at the love that was so clearly written on his face, and he knew that he couldn't take the boy away. To do so would be to inflict a wound that might never heal, on both the man and the child. He backed away from the cradle, his hand falling from his gun. He looked at Jude, a long, hard look that seemed to see into the very depths of his soul. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away. He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving Jude alone with the boy, with the ghosts of his past, and with the fragile, terrifying hope of a future he had never believed he deserved. Jude watched him go, his heart a storm of conflicting emotions. Relief, gratitude, a profound and overwhelming sense of loss. He had been given a second chance, a chance to be something other than a killer, a chance to be a father. But the price of that chance was the knowledge that he had stolen it from another man, from the boy's true family. He went to the cradle and picked up the boy, holding him close. The child looked up at him, his blue eyes clear and trusting. There was no judgment in them, no condemnation, just a simple, unconditional love that Jude had done nothing to earn. He carried the boy outside and stood on the bluff, the wind whipping his hair around his face. He looked out at the vast, empty landscape, at the endless sky. He had been a man who lived by the gun, a man who believed in the simple, brutal justice of the bounty. But life, he was beginning to understand, was not so simple. It was a messy, complicated thing, full of pain and beauty, of sin and redemption. He looked down at the boy in his arms, at the small, perfect face that was a reflection of his own. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever truly escape his past, if he could ever be the man this child deserved, but he knew that he had to try. He had executed 99 men for bounty. The 100th had left him a son, and in the end, that was the only name in the ledger that mattered. The brother of the 100th man, Samuel, did not ride far. He stopped at the edge of the bluff, his horse cropping at the dry grass, and he watched the cabin. He had come for a child, for a piece of his brother that was still alive in the world. He had come for justice. But the man he had found was not the monster he had imagined. The man he had found was a father, in all his broken, terrible glory. He saw Jude come out of the cabin, the baby in his arms. He saw the way the man held the child, with a tenderness that belied the hardness of his face, the violence of his past. He saw the way the baby looked at Jude, with a trust that was absolute, a love that was pure. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had made the right choice. He turned his horse and rode away, not back to the town of redemption, but towards a new life, a new future. He would carry the memory of his brother in his heart, but he would not let it be a poison. He would let it be a lesson about the strange and unexpected ways that life can find to heal itself, to create something new and beautiful out of the ashes of the old. Back at the cabin, Jude held the boy and watched the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He had been given a gift he did not deserve, a gift that came with a heavy price. He would carry that price for the rest of his life, the knowledge of the man he had killed, the family he had broken. But he would also carry the gift, the love of a child who had seen the good in him, even when he could not see it himself. He took the boy back inside and laid him in the cradle. He sat by the fire, the warmth on his face, and he thought about the future. It was a blank page, a story yet to be written. He did not know what it would hold, but he knew that he would not face it alone. He had a son with his eyes, a son who was a reminder of his sins and a promise of his salvation. He picked up a piece of wood and a knife, and he began to carve. He carved a small, wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. He worked late into the night, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft, steady breathing of the sleeping child. When he was finished, he hung the bird over the cradle, where it would spin and dance in the gentle currents of air. It was a small thing, a simple thing, but it was a start. It was a promise to the boy and to himself, a promise that he would be a better man, a promise that he would build a new life, a life not of death, but of love. A life worthy of the child who had been left on his doorstep, the child who had saved him from himself. He looked at the boy, sleeping peacefully in the cradle, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was real. It was the smile of a man who had found his way home. The seasons turned on Widow's Bluff. The harsh winds of winter gave way to the gentle rains of spring, and the sun-baked earth of summer softened into the golden hues of autumn. The boy grew, his legs strengthening, his babbling turning into words. He called Jude Da, a sound that never failed to send a jolt of both pain and joy through the bounty hunter's heart. Jude's hands, once stained with the blood of men, were now stained with the dirt of the garden he had planted. He grew vegetables and herbs, his calloused fingers learning the delicate art of nurturing life from the soil. He taught the boy the names of the birds that nested in the trees around the cabin, his rough voice softening as he pointed out the blue jay, the sparrow, the hawk that circled high above. He never spoke of his past, of the 99 names in the ledger. He kept the chest locked, the key hidden away. But the ghosts were still there, in the quiet moments before dawn, in the long, dark hours of the night. He would wake up, his heart pounding, the faces of the dead swimming in his vision. He would go to the boy's small bed, a bed he had built with his own hands, and he would watch him sleep, his small face peaceful and serene. And the ghosts would retreat, banished by the simple, powerful presence of his son. The boy, whom Jude had named Caleb, was a constant source of wonder. He had a curiosity that was boundless, a spirit that was as wild and free as the mountains themselves. He would spend hours exploring the woods around the cabin, his small legs carrying him over rocks and through streams, his laughter echoing through the trees. Jude would watch him, his heart a mixture of pride and fear. He had brought this child into a world of violence and danger, a world that had almost destroyed him. He prayed every day that Caleb would be spared the same fate. One day, when Caleb was 5 years old, he found the key to the chest. He brought it to Jude, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What's this, Da?" he asked. Jude's blood ran cold. He had hoped this day would never come. He had hoped he could keep his past buried forever, but he knew that he couldn't. The boy had a right to know who his father was, what he had done. He took the key from Caleb's hand and unlocked the chest. He took out the ledger and the wanted posters, his hands trembling. He sat down with the boy, and, in a low, steady voice, he told him everything. He told him about the 99 men he had killed, about the blood on his hands, about the emptiness that had consumed him. He told him about his mother, Alara, and about the man who was his biological father, Abram Mathis. Caleb listened, his blue eyes fixed on his father's face. He didn't cry. He didn't flinch. He simply listened, his small hand resting on Jude's arm. When Jude was finished, the silence in the cabin was heavy, profound. "You're my Da," Caleb said, his voice clear and strong. "That's all that matters." Jude looked at his son, at the love and acceptance in his eyes, and he felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought him to his knees. He pulled the boy into his arms and held him tight. the tears he had held back for so long finally falling, washing away the last of the grime that had clung to his soul. From that day on, the ghosts of the past began to fade. They were still there, a part of his story, a part of who he was, but they no longer had the power to haunt him. He had faced them, had confessed his sins to the one person whose judgment mattered most, and he had been forgiven. Life on Widow's Bluff continued, a quiet, simple life filled with the small, everyday moments that make up a lifetime. Jude taught Caleb how to read and write, how to track an animal, how to build a fire. Caleb taught Jude how to laugh again, how to see the beauty in the world, how to love without reservation. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars come out, a rider approached. It was an old man, his face weathered and kind, his eyes holding a wisdom that spoke of a long and full life. He was a traveling preacher, he said, and he asked if he could rest for the night. Jude welcomed him, offering him a meal and a place by the fire. The preacher, whose name was Elias, had a gentle, calming presence that put Jude at ease. They talked late into the night, about life and death, about sin and redemption. "I have done things in my life that I am not proud of," Jude confessed, his voice low. "I have taken lives. I have caused pain." Elias listened, his gaze steady and compassionate. "We have all done things we regret," he said. "But it is not the past that defines us. It is the choices we make today. It is the love we give. It is the grace we find in the most unexpected of places." He looked at Caleb, who was sleeping soundly by the fire, his small hand clutching the wooden bird Jude had carved for him so many years ago. "You have found your grace, my son," Elias said, his voice soft. "You have found your redemption." The next morning, as Elias was preparing to leave, he turned to Jude. "There is a town a few days' ride from here," he said. "A good town, with a school and a church, a place where a boy can grow up strong and safe." He gave Jude the name of the town and a letter of introduction to the pastor of the church. "It is time to leave this bluff," he said. "It is time to rejoin the world." Jude knew he was right. He had built a life for himself and Caleb on this mountain, a life of solitude and peace. But it was not a life for a growing boy. Caleb needed friends. He needed a community. He needed a world that was bigger than the small patch of land they called home. He sold the cabin and the land to a young couple who were looking for a fresh start, a new beginning. He packed their few belongings, the wooden chest with the ledger and the wanted posters, now a reminder not of his sins, but of the journey that had brought him to this place. He and Caleb rode away from Widow's Bluff, not looking back. They were heading towards a new life, a new future, a new beginning. They were heading towards a town where no one knew the name Jude Rell, the bounty hunter. A town where he could be just a father, and Caleb could be just a boy. The journey was long, but their hearts were light. They talked and laughed, they sang songs, they marveled at the beauty of the world around them. Jude felt a sense of peace he had never known, a sense of hope that was as vast and endless as the sky above. They arrived in the town, a bustling, friendly place with a white-steepled church and a schoolhouse filled with the sound of children's laughter. Jude found work as a carpenter, his hands, once so skilled with a gun, now skilled with a hammer and a saw. He built houses and furniture, he repaired fences and roofs, he built a life. Caleb thrived in the new town. He made friends, he excelled in school, he joined the church choir, his clear, sweet voice rising in praise. He was a happy, well-adjusted boy, his past a distant memory, a story that had been told and then put away. Jude watched him grow, his heart filled with a love that was fierce and protective. He was a good father. He was a good man. He had found his redemption, not in the fire and brimstone of a preacher's sermon, but in the simple, unconditional love of a child. One Sunday, after church, as they were walking home, They passed the town's small cemetery. Caleb stopped and looked at the gravestones, his young face serious. "Da," he said. "Do you think my other father is in a place like this?" Jude's heart clenched. He had not spoken of Abram Mathis in years, had not wanted to cast a shadow on Caleb's happiness. But he knew that the boy had not forgotten. "I don't know, son," Jude said, his voice gentle. "But I hope he has found peace." "I think he has," Caleb said, his voice soft. "Because he has you to look after me." He took Jude's hand, his small fingers wrapping around Jude's calloused ones. "I love you, Da," he said. "I love you too, son," Jude said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than words can say." They walked on, hand in hand, the sun warm on their faces, the future stretching out before them, a road paved with hope and love and the promise of a life well lived. The bounty hunter was gone, the ghosts of the past laid to rest. In his place was a father, a man who had found his salvation in the eyes of a child, a man who had learned that the greatest treasure in the world was not gold, but grace. Years passed. Caleb grew into a fine young man, his father's strength in his shoulders, his mother's kindness in his eyes. He fell in love, he married, he had children of his own. Jude became a grandfather, his heart overflowing with a joy he had never thought possible. He lived a long and peaceful life, a life filled with the love of his family, the respect of his community. He died in his sleep at the age of 87, a smile on his face, his hand holding a small, worn wooden bird. He was buried in the town cemetery next to his wife, Caleb's mother, who had passed away a few years earlier. His gravestone was simple, with just his name and the dates of his birth and death. There was no mention of the 99 men he had killed, no mention of the bounty hunter he had once been. There was no need. That man was long gone, a ghost of a forgotten past. But sometimes, on a quiet evening, when the wind was just right, you could hear a faint, mournful sound on Widow's Bluff. It was the sound of the wind whistling through the trees, a sound that some said was the cry of a lonely soul, a soul still searching for redemption. But those who knew the story of Jude Rell, the story of the bounty hunter and the baby with his eyes, they knew better. They knew that the sound was not a cry of sorrow, but a song of gratitude. A song for the man who had found his grace, his salvation, in the most unexpected of places. A song for the father who had been born from the ashes of a killer. A song for the love that had conquered death, the love that had redeemed a soul. The legacy of Jude Rell was not one of violence and death, but one of love and forgiveness. It was a legacy that lived on in his son, in his grandchildren, in the stories that were told around the fire on a cold winter's night. It was a legacy that proved that even the most broken of men can be made whole again, that even the darkest of souls can find the light. It was a legacy that whispered on the wind, a timeless reminder that the greatest bounty of all is not the price on a man's head, but the love in a human heart. And so the story of Jude Rell, the bounty hunter who executed 99 men, became a legend of a man who was saved by a child, a man who learned that true strength is not in the power to take a life, but in the courage to nurture one. A legend that was a testament to the enduring power of hope, the transformative power of love, and the infinite capacity of the human heart for redemption. A legend that would be told for generations to come, a beacon of light in a world that was often dark and unforgiving. A legend that began with a cry in the silence and ended with a song on the wind. The brother of the 100th man, Samuel, never returned to redemption. He built a new life for himself in a town far to the east, a town where no one knew his name or the tragedy that had befallen his family. He married, he had children, he became a respected member of his community. But he never forgot the man on the bluff, the man with the eyes of a killer and the hands of a father. He never forgot the choice he had made, the choice to leave his nephew in the care of the man who had killed his brother. He carried that choice with him always, a quiet burden in his heart. He wondered, in the long, dark hours of the night, if he had done the right thing. He wondered if his nephew was safe, if he was happy, if he knew the truth of his past. One day, many years later, a traveler passed through his town, a man who had come from the west. Samuel, his hair now gray, his face lined with the years, struck up a conversation with the traveler, asking him about the lands he had seen, the people he had met. The traveler spoke of a town nestled in the mountains, a town where a man named Jude Rell had lived, a man who was known for his skill as a carpenter, his kindness, his devotion to his son. He spoke of a boy named Caleb, a boy who had grown into a fine young man, a man who was loved and respected by all who knew him. Samuel listened, his heart pounding in his chest. He asked the traveler to describe Jude Rell, to describe his son. And as the traveler spoke, a picture formed in Samuel's mind, a picture of the man on the bluff, a picture of the baby in the cradle. Tears streamed down Samuel's face, tears of relief, of gratitude, of a peace he had not known in years. He had made the right choice. He had given his nephew a chance at a life he could never have provided, a life of love and security, a life free from the shadow of the past. He thanked the traveler, his voice thick with emotion. And that night, for the first time in many years, he prayed. He prayed for his brother, for his nephew, and for the man who had taken everything from him, and in doing so had given him the greatest gift of all, the gift of forgiveness, the gift of peace. And so, the story of Jude Rell and Abram Mathis, of a killer and his victim, of a father and a son, came full circle. It was a story of violence and loss, but it was also a story of hope and redemption. It was a story that proved that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of light. It was a story that would live on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that the bonds of love are stronger than the chains of hate, and that the greatest legacy a man can leave is not the wealth he accumulates, but the love he shares. The wind still blows on Widow's Bluff, a lonely, mournful sound. But for those who know the story, it is not a sound of sorrow, but a sound of hope. It is the sound of a father's love, a son's forgiveness, and a brother's grace. It is the sound of a story that will never be forgotten, a story that will be told and retold, a story that will continue to inspire and to heal, for as long as the wind blows and the stars shine down on the wide, open spaces of the American West. The final confrontation, however, was not to be with Samuel, or with the ghosts of the past. It was to come from a place Jude had long since forgotten, a place he had buried under years of dust and blood. It came in the form of a man with a face like a hawk, and eyes as cold as a winter sky. A man who had been there at the beginning, a man who had set Jude on his path of destruction. His name was Silas Kane, and he had been Jude's mentor, the man who had taught him the trade of bounty hunting. He was a man without a soul, a man who killed for the pleasure of it, the money just an excuse. He had seen the darkness in Jude, the same darkness that resided in him, and he had nurtured it, had shaped it, had turned it into a weapon. He had heard the stories of Jude Rell, the man who had given up the gun for a hammer, the man who had traded the thrill of the hunt for the quiet life of a father, and he had been disgusted. He saw it as a betrayal, a weakness. He saw it as a stain on the legacy he had tried to create. He came to the town, not for revenge, not for money, but for something far more sinister. He came to reclaim what he believed was his. He came to take the darkness back. He found Jude in his workshop, the scent of sawdust and varnish hanging in the air. Jude looked up, his hand freezing on the piece of wood he was carving. He recognized Silas instantly. The years had not changed, the cold, predatory look in his eyes. "Silas," Jude said, his voice a low growl. "Jude," Silas said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "I heard you'd gone soft. I didn't believe it. But here you are, playing with wood like an old woman." He stepped into the workshop, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the tools, the half-finished furniture, the small wooden bird that hung from a rafter. "You've gotten sentimental in your old age," he sneered. "What do you want, Silas?" Jude asked, his hand slowly moving towards a heavy mallet that lay on the workbench. "I want to remind you of who you are," Silas said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're not a carpenter. You're not a father. You're a killer. It's in your blood. It's who you were born to be." He took a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "I'm here to offer you a partnership," he said, "a chance to come back to the life you were meant for. There's a new bounty out, a big one, $1,000 for the head of a man who's been causing trouble down south. We could take him together, like the old days." Jude looked at Silas, at the emptiness in his eyes, at the darkness that radiated from him like a cold, black sun, and he saw himself, the man he had been, the man he could have become, and he was filled with a revulsion so profound it made him sick to his stomach. "I'm not that man anymore," Jude said, his voice firm. Silas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You can't escape what you are, Jude. You can't wash the blood off your hands." He pulled his gun, the hammer clicking back with a sound that was deafening in the quiet of the workshop. "I'm going to prove it to you," he said. "I'm going to take away the thing that has made you weak. I'm going to take your son." In that moment, something inside Jude snapped. The years of peace, of quiet contemplation, of gentle love were stripped away, revealing the raw, primal core of the man he had once been. But it was not the cold, calculating killer that emerged. It was something else. It was the fierce, protective rage of a father. He moved with a speed that belied his age, his hand closing around the mallet. He brought it up in a wide, sweeping arc, the heavy piece of wood whistling through the air. Silas, caught off guard by the suddenness of the attack, fired his gun, the bullet splintering the wall behind Jude. The mallet connected with Silas's arm, the sound of bone breaking a sickening crack. The gun clattered to the floor. Silas screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and disbelief. Jude stood over him, the mallet raised, his face a mask of cold, hard fury. He could have killed him. He could have brought the mallet down on his skull and ended it, right there, right then. The old Jude, the bounty hunter, would have done it without a second thought. But as he looked down at the pathetic, whimpering man at his feet, he saw not an enemy, not a monster, but a sad, broken old man, a man consumed by his own darkness. And he knew that killing him would solve nothing. It would only drag him back into the world he had fought so hard to escape. He lowered the mallet, his breathing ragged. "Get out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Get out of my town, and if I ever see you again, I will kill you." Silas scrambled to his feet, clutching his broken arm, his face a mixture of fear and hatred. He stumbled out of the workshop and disappeared into the night, a ghost from a past that was finally, truly dead. Jude stood in the quiet of the workshop, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body, leaving him weak and trembling. He had faced his final demon, not with a gun, but with a choice to be a man of peace, a man of love, a man of grace. He heard a sound at the door and turned to see Caleb standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He had seen everything. "Da," he whispered. Jude went to his son and pulled him into his arms, holding him tight. "It's over," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's finally over." They stood there for a long time, father and son, two halves of a whole, their love a shield against the darkness of the world. The ghosts were gone, the demons vanquished. The bounty hunter was dead. In his place was a man who had found his redemption, not in the eyes of God, but in the love of his son. A man who had learned that the greatest battle is not fought with guns and knives, but with the courage to choose love over hate, hope over despair, life over death. A man who had finally, truly come home. He couldn't shoot, not with the child watching.